Welcome to the Decentralized podcast, where we break down the world of Web3, digital assets, and DAOs with me, your host, Pietri Basson. Braxton Woodham, welcome to the Decentralized podcast.
Thank you.
Co-creator of DSNP, CTO for Project Liberty. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise.
Yeah. I was thinking an interesting place to kick off is a little bit of your background. I know you've been involved with actually starting a social network. What was that experience like, and what were some of the challenges you saw and sort of some of the problems that you saw when you were working on that?
Sure. I mean, that's really the roots of this project. It goes back to this first company I co-founded in 2006. It really dates me. And we were, fairly naive young entrepreneurs at the time. Built an early mobile social network. This is right before the iPhone came out, if you can imagine that world. And we were just seeing video on phones starting to happen. And we actually scaled up really quickly because that was a time in history where you could actually acquire people very cost effectively in a way it's hard today. There's so much competition for attention. But back then it just wasn't as well developed an ecosystem. So we had tens of millions of people globally on our network called Xanil. And we were not prepared for what happens when people have phones and can do video. It was a lot of PTSD, I should say, from all the crazy things that we saw on our network. So that's was kind of a harsh dose of reality of how the moderation challenges are very real and they're very complex, especially when you get to video. And there were really primitive tools at that time to deal with that. We pivoted that company because of that. Actually, we could not even handle it, and we were across the street from Twitter. And they just had text at that time, so they had their moderation was they could even without even AI just programmatically look for bad words and things. It was very straightforward. And so as they were taking off, we said this real-time web is happening where people are communicating in a social context more immediately. We should build we could do it. We understand this. Let's build an analytics engine for this, and that will be our company. So we pivoted to become a company called Tap 11. We were one of a few startups that actually got the full Twitter fire hose, and that's actually, that's when I learned about this technology. We had clients including Google and Disney, so big clients. We had the entire Twitter fire hose, which at that time was already fairly sizable, and we would basically pick off tweets that were like relevant to Disney's interests, like their Disney characters or ESPN sports. And then we would do a deeper analysis. But what it made me realize was, one, this architecture of a social network and the stream of media tied to a social graph following, we really got familiar with that. And number two, that it doesn't have to be in one platform, because all of it was in our platform too. So we thought this could be actually, this information could be just across the internet in a way that all platforms can read and write from this stream. It doesn't need to be just about one platform. And then we all know the story that Twitter eventually shut down the access through the APIs, and we sold the company in 2011. But that time frame around 2008-9 is when I started thinking about the protocol that ultimately became DSNP.
Okay, no, that's I think very, very early. So I think it's interesting that you saw those really early days. You had full access to Twitter, seeing sort of how the machine works in the back end a little bit. I think one of the interesting things we're seeing these days is it feels like a lot of social networks are very divisive. Like the protocol sitting in the back end is almost forcing divisiveness because people engage with that. What are some of the sort of challenges in line with that you're seeing with social networks as they exist at the moment?
Well, that was we definitely had a front row seat for that, and what we saw was that it's been kind of terrifying to see this scale, but the fact that in this big room social, you get into smaller and smaller sound bites, and emotionally triggering content drives actions more than content that's more constructive, that is typically is softer, slower, deeper content. So, and then as these companies needed to drive growth and profits, of course, that gave birth to what's now known as the surveillance economy, and so that definitely has kind of been a runaway train that we started to be concerned about in 2008-9, that time frame, At that time, it was more an intellectual concern in some ways about just this ownership of the data that consumers the product, seeing that's already problematic, and then seeing that it seems like this is kind of going in the wrong direction as far as the incentives to drive more engagement, et cetera. It's everything from screen time to the polarization, disinformation. Those are all different symptoms of the same underlying problem. And fundamentally, the insight was the tremendous power of big tech derives from these network effects. But if you think as a technologist as an engineer about the network effects, what is that? It's really just the database of the connections between people. So when you log in, you see other people. Facebook had that finding that once you have 5 friends, you're hooked. It's like those graph connections matter. So even though you may be on TikTok with an interest graph or Facebook with a social graph, we think of it all in terms of these graphs of connections that are so powerful, and they should be a public resource, and then we should innovate on top. And the only way to do that is A, to have a protocol, but B, this is where it gets to the Web3 side, was you need somewhere to store that data that's not centralized, not tied to one party, because Amazon has the world's largest database of social data on products, right? Like you can look at all the product reviews. Facebook with the social graph and social media. So, across the board, it's databases that concentrate the power. Interesting with Apple, a lot of it was a database of credit cards. They had a billing relationship with most people, and that's hugely valuable, right? So in 2014, we sold that company in 2011 to the YouTube founders, and got some more experience looking at the network effects, because they just came out of YouTube, and we were building other technology with them, and kept thinking about the protocol. But then in 2014, I started reading about Ethereum, and I thought, it was like a light bulb. Like, this is how you can create that shared data layer that everybody can access that isn't controlled by any one centralized party. So then for years, kind of kept stewing on this idea of a protocol with blockchain. And we started, Harry, our co-founder here at DSP, and I started with some other folks a fintech company in blockchain. A part of that motivation was to learn more about the space and the technology and work with it hands-on. And then started working with Frank McCord in 2019, and then conversation with him led to my involvement with him, and then what became the technology with Project Liberty.
Okay, that's very exciting. It's interesting seeing sort of that road that you walked to getting to here. You mentioned in the beginning it was a very theoretical. You then saw Ethereum. I know you also helped to create the Decentralized Social Network Protocol, so DSNP. So what is DSNP, and what is it sort of solving for?
So DSNP is solving for this, what we think is really the third era of the internet. So era 1 in this conception is just connecting the world to computers, and that centers around the open protocols, TCP/IP. There are other protocols. We have Dave Clark, who is one of the original chief architect of TCP/IP, is on our advisory council and works weekly with our team to help us think long view about what we're building. The second era, is the web. So you think about the first era with all the computers connected. The second era was linking all the data, right, and it's centering on HTTP. The third era, which quickly came, was this era of connecting all the people, and it's a social era. Not just social media, although that's a huge part of it, but really just the idea that people you have an identity online, you have a profile, and really many profiles is the reality in different ways, right? And that all kind of emerged. But that third era, what I think went wrong was the core infrastructure. There was no more, I noticed it as a developer, no more public infrastructure being built. I wasn't reading about new protocols anymore. It was all privatized. And part of that, I think, is because of the fact that you needed shared state or a data layer to do a lot of that third era work around profiles and personal interactions. And so it naturally became privatized. But then with the breakthrough from Satoshi Nakamoto, there's a protocol for how to actually share data in a way that nobody controls the database. Obviously, then Ethereum took that to a different level, and so we said, well, now is the time to create this protocol. a very critical point, though, and Frank, credit to him, realized this early on, and it's been a lot of expensive in terms of time and money to do this, but a very early insight is that if you think about the course of history, there's always a risk of economic capture with any system, and we're fairly early in the history of decentralized tokenized systems, and so we thought, well, it would be very important to create a protocol that's independent of any particular blockchain or token, and then develop implementations leveraging that technology of the protocol. So that's what we did. Mm-hmm. And so we think of DSNP as a protocol like HTTP, and then Frequency is a blockchain that we've contributed to. We think of it more like Netscape server. It's like there could be other web servers. That's just one. And that's why, we've been looking at different ecosystems. And so we have a history here where we first implemented DSNP on Ethereum, actually, in 2020. At that time, Ethereum was in a place where it was very difficult to do that in the way we did it. There was a lot of massive fluctuation of cost and latency on Ethereum. So we then looked at 30 different Web3 projects and ultimately concluded that the best place to try to build would be in the Polkadot ecosystem. That actually worked very well technically and we've scaled up now over 1 million users on chain. I think we're pretty consistently the largest, most active chain in the Polkadot ecosystem now. But we always envisioned this being multi-chain and not tied to one ecosystem, and so that's why we've now partnered with Consensus and now expanding into the Ethereum ecosystem with Frequency as well.
I think that's very, very exciting, especially, the interoperability of Ethereum, how many users you can potentially see. What's really interesting for me is, you've mentioned the social graph, but I think over here, then the potential for you to own your own social graph. Yeah. So can you maybe, just for anyone who isn't familiar with what a social graph is, explain what that is, and then what some of the benefits are to actually owning your own social graph?
Sure, it's a really important question. I think that, well, first of all, let's say there's many graphs that are relevant for any individual, but one of those is certainly your social graph, and that's really just the relationships you have with everybody that you associate with in any way. And so the nodes of a graph are the people, your identity, and their identity, and the vertices are the relationships, right? So you and I you're on my graph, of course, because we've been working together now for years. Ursula's on my graph, right, as well. And we all have our graphs, but they aren't just about friends. They're also about people. If you follow a politician or you follow any kind of public figure, they're also about your bankers or anybody you interact with. So we think about social networking as really the encompasses all human interactions of any sort. Now, it might take a lot of time before a lot of this technology it gets leveraged into all those activities like banking and healthcare, but it ultimately will. It seems clear cut that will happen over time. The next thing I would say is there are more than just social graphs. There are other kind of graphs, right? Interest graphs and different things. TikTok is a great example with an interest graph. So I think that really you should, each individual should own their own graph of information. And with the emergence of AI agents, it's going to be really critical that data and the data sets, that you have your own personal AI training data set that you control. You can contribute to other training sets, but you should have control over that, have insight into that, and have economic participation in the benefits of that. And so this framework is about laying the groundwork for all of that.
I think you've touched on so many interesting points there, because I think what's really interesting for me especially is the economic benefit, but as well as you control what people see. And I think one of the very good examples was I go to a bar and I need to prove that I'm older than 18, but at the moment I have to show my full ID with my address, everything else in there. So you could potentially share specific information, but there's also benefit for companies if they incentivize people correctly to share certain pieces of information.
That's right.
So I think we see new types of economies potentially evolving that benefits both parties, because the companies get cleaner data potentially, but the end user gets some incentive or they get a benefit from there. I don't know if you guys have thought about other use cases or other benefits in line with that.
Well, I'll say, as a longtime data engineer, which is kind of how I think about most of my work, it drives me crazy how primitive we still the tools we use are with respect to data. So there's two concepts you kind of addressed there that I think are both important. One of them is data minimism, which is one of our core design principles we outlined for our team back at the very beginning of this project 5 years ago. To your very point, that if I want to have access to a bar, I should be able to say I'm over 21. That's it. And there are ways now to prove that, right? With proofs that would do that, and there'd be no question that that's true. It doesn't matter that how far over 21 I am, to your point, or what my address is. So data minimism is already easily achievable, and it's an important point for privacy considerations. I think a lot of people out there would appreciate that kind of privacy, where they could decide whether they want to reveal their age specifically or not, but they don't, or their address or what have you. The second concept you address is on the value exchange, and I think that once again it drives me crazy how inefficient these current surveillance systems are. I use this example of I play guitar, and if Gibson wanted to know, do I like this kind of P90 pickups or humbuckers or whatever, I would just tell them. I would gladly tell them, and especially if there was a way to tell them, and maybe a benefit, maybe I get a discount on my next purchase or something. It might not be just, dollars for that data, because at the individual component level that's small, but it can aggregate up, right? So I think about all the information that's not being shared that could be shared, people would gladly share, that's locked up because there's no mechanism for that. So I think we're hoping this unlocks both data minimism, so more privacy, but also more sharing in the right way. So I think we're undersharing and oversharing in both directions.
I think where this becomes really interesting for me is this almost becomes your identity on chain that you control, and it's similar to your identity online at the moment.
Yeah.
But I think that on-chain identity, if I put it that way, becomes really important, because for people selling products, they don't know if you're dealing with just an address out there. Is this a user? What have they done, etc. For me as a person, I've got multiple wallets. I don't have any one wallet that's my identity. But if we can start building real identities, and then you can have property associated with that, KYC associated with that, etc., it is almost that next layer of the internet, as you say.
That's right. In fact, I was talking to somebody recently about tokenomics, and they made a really good point that hey, what tokenomic systems have you seen that really have stood the test of time outside of core chains and dexes? And I said, well, that's interesting, but one of the challenges we've seen, especially with decentralized social, is if you try to start to tokenize human behavior, there's so many non-linearities there. It's hard to create a sustainable tokenomic model around that level of complexity. Really, what we're building is a core chain for social. So the way we look at that is our tokenomics are around just the bandwidth required for humans to communicate, which is something that's going to always be there. But I'll give you a specific example. When Twitter broke out, and I was there at South by, a key use case was where are the parties at South by Southwest, and you would use Twitter for that. I don't think anybody uses Twitter for where's the party now, but that use case then was really important and valuable. Now there's different use cases on X. It's just evolved, right? So trying to tokenize and build incentive models around particular human behavior, it'll probably happen, but it's very tricky to do because it changes. It's very dynamic, and there's a lot of nonlinearities in human behavior. Whereas building a core chain just focused on, hey, we're going to support the dynamics of social networking at the kind of infrastructure level, kind of like the web services of the cloud computing provider for social. That's a different story, and so our tokenomics, or not ours, but the tokenomics for frequency are all around capacity, right, to run these things, applications, stake tokens to get capacity on the network, and then the tokens, kind of the demand for those tokens will scale as the population in the network scales linearly, and it's not a speculative situation. It's not gonna go up and down and be all dynamic. It's more of as the population grows, it grows, and in a very steady and stable kind of way. So it's interesting. Audrey Tang took if you know her, she's a well-known open source technologist, and she looked at our tech and she said it was one of the only uses of blockchain she thought was like a really good use of blockchain. So I think we're I think we're onto something here about just a core chain for social.
Well, I mean, I think one of the use cases as a core chain for social that for me was interesting is the ability to move potentially.
Yeah.
Because people can build different apps on top of your product. But if I don't like where this specific social network is going, I can actually move.
Right.
Which at the moment you can't really. So I think that for me is exciting to have the choice over there built in, and you're able to take all of your data, potentially, deactivate access almost,
right,
and then move over to a new one.
Definitely, and there's a lot of nuances to that we're trying not to design make this highly composable. So there'll be some pieces that other developers, other development groups and communities work out, even other protocols. But you're right, at the core, that is exactly what we're trying to facilitate. And it just simplifies down to that. Just move the incredibly powerful network effects out of these big tech platforms and into the core infrastructure that we all can access, and then let the different developers do their thing from there to create all the specific points of value and unlocks, which I think there will be so many.
Well, I mean, thinking about unlocks, I mean, AI is very relevant at the moment. Everyone's thinking about it. And one of the things I thought about was if I actually have an identity that everyone agrees this is my identity, I can potentially validate that the video is me posting it. So this podcast isn't just AI generated. I can actually go sign it and say, yes, this is Beatrice.
Exactly.
Or alternatively, we can identify, deepfakes. We can identify other things.
That's right.
On that side, it's also interesting, given where we are in the world.
Completely, and it helps with. You can imagine it unlocks moderation and curation, right? I've heard examples of people tagging artwork as AI, and the idea of I want to filter out, not see any AI generated artwork. I want to see only artwork by real people. All those things are become possible, and you can do identity credential stacking, where you don't want to bring your whole identity to necessarily a social situation, but for the future for financial transactions, a deeper stack of KYC and all these things, and a shallower stack in other situations. We've also called them identity facets. You may want to show up differently, and the way you go to a place of business or a church or a pub, those are all very different situations. So you don't want to just take this monolithic identity stack around. You want to switch out kind of certain components as you move around.
That's actually really interesting, yes, because I mean, if you see it especially in Web3, where people might have a pseudo-anonymous identity and they'll have a normal identity. Yeah. So I might have my NFT profile pic that I interact in certain ways, and my LinkedIn profile pic that's much more professional. But using this, you could also then almost create those identities linked to one sort of identity that's you, but on different platforms.
Exactly. We're using zero knowledge proofs. You can do some really interesting stuff, right? We talk sometimes about the case of the masquerade ball, where it's like we're going to have a digital masquerade ball for alumni of Georgetown University, as an example, and we can do proofs that you have a Georgetown degree. You uniquely have that unique degree, that stamp, so you get access, but like the data minimism, but you don't know who you are. You're wearing the mask, but you're just a Georgetown, right? Then you can enter in conversations without that overhang of like who you are specifically. You can imagine then that facilitates dialogues, sensitive dialogues about, hey, we want to get feedback. People don't want to have retribution, so I want to hear feedback from professors about what we're doing right or wrong in the administration. Most professors are like, well, I want to make sure I get tenure. I don't want to be on record complaining. But if it's like I can prove I'm a Georgetown professor, that's it. Maybe I'll give you more candid feedback, or that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of opportunities with this identity kind of solution.
That's interesting, because I mean, a lot of people say we're in a post-truth or post-trust sort of society at the moment, and something like this can bring that back in. Is you can validate that, yes, this person is what they are, or I can trust this person because of these specific things. And I think, we could foster better dialogue, better interactions on the internet. Because at the moment, some of the anonymity in there, has negative impacts as well.
Definitely. I think there's that dynamic between truth and trust. It's kind of like one of those security and freedom trade-offs. Everybody wants to be secure and free, and and so I completely agree with you. There's something interesting about blockchain technology that addresses some, I think, gaps we've had with truth, but that hopefully will have effects on trust. But we used to use institutions for that, but interestingly, trust has eroded in institutions. So I think that we're at a time in history where it could be an inflection point where now we could use blockchain to fill those gaps with some truth, but that would actually in turn unlock more trust in society again if we can get it right. Feels urgent right now to do that.
No, definitely. I think one of the points you just hit on is security as well on the blockchain. I think one of the benefits as well is your personal data being much more secure in a blockchain. You mentioned it's not all in one centralized pool. Sort of what is the security benefits of doing this for my personal data if I...
Right. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because I think that the concerns I hear people have around on-chain security reminds me of when people probably 10 years ago were worried about moving to the cloud. And then there was that meme like, the cloud is just a computer that somebody else operates. It's not some different thing. So, but there was a lot of, it's hard for some IT folks to remember this, but there was a lot of trepidation about putting your database in the cloud back in the day. And now it's pretty clear it's actually more secure. If you also look back in time, a lot of trepidation about open source software. Now people mostly agree that Linux is a more secure operating system than more of the closed operating systems, where you don't have the researchers who can't look at the code and actually work out the bugs and help solve, lock this stuff down in a more secure fashion. So I think blockchain is going through a similar case where people are skeptical, but over time I think they'll realize it's actually one of the most secure options, just like cloud computing became that, and so forth. I do think, though, on the flip side, there's this idea of immutability. Immutable storage is complex, and I know we work with that a lot. So what you want to store in an immutable database is something that's really important to consider. So, for instance, we don't store any media on-chain at all, and we really don't even store directly the links on-chain. It's more of we think of it like the transaction log of human communications and anchoring the truth on-chain. But there's reasons you may want a video or picture to go away and not be remembered. So we think it's important that we are really judicious and try to minimize what data is in the immutable database. It's an expensive way to store data, obviously, in terms of time and cost anyway, but also just in terms of social norms. I think we as a society are still in the process of absorbing what it's like to have immutable storage. I think the average consumer is not even thinking about it. So I think that's ahead of us, and a lot of philosophers and other people have got to weigh in on this stuff. So we're just keeping most of that data off chain while we work through it.
The picture you posted when you were 21, it's potentially there forever. I mean, you can move it. On that topic, I think something that's interesting to think about is then also sort of moderation, censorship, and how, if you've got this on a blockchain, you can work on the governance, censorship with the community.
Right.
How have you guys thought around that?
We've thought a lot about this idea of federated or stacked moderation. So the idea is, I think that first of all, ideally there'll be interaction with other government bodies and other bodies that are better suited to do a lot of this stuff. But the simple thought that we started with was, would you rather have all of human communication moderated by one company with one CEO and one board, or would you rather have different groups be able to kind of participate in how we moderate our communication? As a specific example, like COVID posts about COVID, would you rather have public health professionals involved with that, public health organizations, or would you rather have just some private company deciding what you see? So I think the answer there is pretty clear. Like, obviously, it'd be better to not have one private company making those decisions. And then, of course, how to make that composable so people can stack moderation in different ways is the next piece of that. So there's been good examples like Reddit, where there's like a baseline moderation Reddit does, and within subreddits you have moderators mods who make decisions on top of that. So you can imagine apps for children, certain groups might have different layers of moderation on top of the baseline moderation, so it gets more and more strict and narrow in certain apps. That's what we want to have, is that portability becomes critical. You can choose, like, exactly. I want to be in a PG environment. That's my choice. I know it's being moderated that way, and I'm choosing it. Now my life changed. I want to be out of that environment, or maybe my day changed. I want to be out of that. Choosing that as well. And I think that choice is really important that we don't have today.
Yeah, no, I think that's the moderation plus the choice, I think, is actually exciting.
Yeah.
Because you can pick. I can be in the open forum of the internet where I might see things that I don't agree with, or I can be somewhere that's a little bit more moderated and controlled.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the interesting challenges for anything is adoption. And
Yes.
how do you get more users and all that? Have you guys thought about ways to potentially hack, get more users onto the platform, sort of exposed to this? Because I think if people, get a taste of this and understand it, they'll adopt it much quicker.
That's actually where I've been spending most of my time. I try
Okay.
to different people focus on different things, but I've spent a lot of time on that. So a few key points on adoption. So it's hugely a critical phase for us right now. Is that point number one is we don't believe that what we're addressing is really important, but we don't believe it's a strong consumer value prop to focus on owning your own identity and data. Conversationally, anybody would agree, but would they actually take actions to do that? So we don't think that's a consumer value prop. We're focused more on communities and applications that, for example, developers have been built on Facebook and got locked out. You heard from Paul Allen today that this idea of an ecosystem like this resonates with them. Like I can build here and have solve my single sign-on, and I can get access to network effects that aren't going to be yanked away by decisions by a private company. So we think about that approach to growth, and we think about long term, new innovative apps will definitely be growing and thriving and bringing in lots of people. But in the short term, migrating people from kind of where they are, meet people where they are, they kind of migrate onto Web3 within an app without having to learn some crazy new experience and getting involved with wallets and so forth and passphrases. We think that's important. So we spend a lot of time on one is tokenless activity. So with MeWe, there are 1.3 million users. None of them are interacting with frequency tokens or anything. They're on chain with a kind of Web2 experience. We've iterated, and now at this conference we announced that code we're actually transferring to the Institute nonprofit as Login with Liberty, and then any other app can use that to create this kind of single sign-on that is not. There's nobody behind it making money from it. It's just a gift, to give people back their freedom on the internet. So that's kind of a key part of our growth strategy is to partner with bigger players. So we saw some announcements here, like We Are 8 that they're coming in, and so forth. We'll have more announcements over time. Soar's building apps in their App Studio. There's new apps as well being built. We also just launched our developer portal the developer portal for Frequency. So anybody can come self-service their way in now, and it's always been there, and it's very modular, but just takes time and effort to document that stuff and set it up so developers can go and really engage. So we're trying to focus on all those tracks that basically people can come and build new apps without having to talk to any particular people. It's all decentralized. People can come in and bring and migrate their user bases over, and in that case, through the FNF, we will support and work on migration support services like we did with MeWe and everything in between.
No, I think that's you have to almost build it from the ground up, show people the value, and then get there. To wrap things up, we always ask people in the industry or in this area specifically, what are you excited about at the moment?
Wow, well, that's a good question. I'm really excited about this, the friction going down on wallets and passkey and that technology. I'm excited about threshold cryptography and ways to kind of make key management more manageable without impacting user experience. I think those are critical pieces of infrastructure we need to drive adoption. Mm-hmm. So I think I think we're at a really interesting point right now. We're about to see some real human flourishing on these new networks if we can just all kind of hang together. The key part to me is if we can blend cooperation in with this competition we typically have in tech, cooperate together. That's what you're probably seeing here at the conference is a lot of different projects that can compete on certain ways, but also trying to cooperate on how do we build some core connective tissue here to create more public infrastructure to go along with the innovation that happens with private companies or with tokenized chains.
No, I agree completely. I think the user experience to date hasn't been as smooth.
Yeah.
So we're getting there where, if someone logs on, they don't even know what's going on in the background. They get the benefits of it, but without some of the friction.
That's right.
to not only focus on the positive, what are you concerned with in the industry at the moment?
Well, I mean, in the U.S. especially, we're going through a big change, and I think it's politically. I think most people agree it's likely to have impacts on regulatory environment. So I've got a kind of twin hope and fear here, which is two sides of the coin. The hopeful side is that we can actually not have as much regulation by enforcement. We can actually innovate more, so allow us to accelerate our efforts. On the flip side, I worry that the wrong people with the wrong motivations will start building without guardrails, and we'll have more of the challenges we had with other big blowouts in Web3 that weren't great for this industry. So I hope there'll be more focus on using this technology to really benefit mankind. You can still build projects, create real value, and do exciting things, but building it for the right reasons and trying to think long term versus kind of short term gain. So my biggest fear is that we swing back too far towards that Wild West, but we'll see how it plays out.
Well, I mean, I think regulators and others are paying more attention to this area and other areas. So hopefully we'll see some guide rails at least, but not too much.
Right. When I have innovation.
Yes.
And also have an environment that really protects consumers and protects.
Definitely. Well, Braxton, this has been a really fun conversation. I think a really interesting topic. If people want to learn more about Frequency, what you're working on, what's the best place for them to go?
Frequency.xyz. That's the answer.
Perfect.
It's all there.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Decentralized podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and would really appreciate if you could like and share if you got any value from this episode. Please also make sure you follow us on YouTube or wherever you're listening to your podcast to make sure you don't miss the following episodes. If you want to connect with me, you can connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. We've got the links down in the description. And I'd also like to thank our partner for this episode, Hash Directors. Hash provides independent directors to Cayman Islands-based digital asset funds, foundations, as well as BVI entities. And the team over at Hash are really experienced. They can make sure that you consider all of the different things that you need to look at when setting up a company. They really know their governance as well as regulatory compliance. If you want to learn more about Hash Directors, there's a link down in the description. I'll see you on the next episode.